Hello and welcome to Hours of Harvard on this wonderful and sunny November afternoon. We are doing the books of November a little bit early since the end of this month I'm going to be very busy with going overseas and planning things and getting ready for the end of the year. So there are 5 books this month, or 4. They are all very great in their own right. So I had a lot to do and think about and talk about for each one, and one of them is the ebook, of course. It's just very enjoyable. I've had a very edifying reading month, and I'm very glad to talk about all of these, except this one, book number 1, Rites of Passage. William Golding is the author famous for writing The Lord of the Flies, had a quite prolific writing career, and actually won the Nobel Prize, and also won the Booker Prize for this book, Rites of Passage. It is the first book in a trilogy called the Sea Trilogy, which is mainly set in the 1800s about naval voyages around England and its colonial powers. I did not like this. I did not like this book, and I think a lot of the things I don't like about this book resonate with the things I don't like about The Lord of the Flies, which is a much more famous book and the book that Golding is kind of remembered for. So, actually, midway through reading this, I thought to myself, I want to record the reaction I have to this book right now, because I don't think I'll remember it by the end of the month, and then some stuff happens. Basically, the premise is that we follow this fairly wealthy man named Mr. Talbot. He is on a frigate, and it's a ship where, in the tradition of a lot of naval narratives, the traditional social hierarchies of England are kind of broken down. So whilst Mr. Talbot in England could rely on the aristocracy, could rely on kind of like a wealth imbalance to enact power over other people, he finds himself unable to do this on the ship, and despite being someone that has quite a high thought for themselves, experiences quite negative conditions on the ship, whereas it is just like things being dirty, or things being smelly, or not having someone to boss around. Things that me, reading this today, find quite laughable. I think this character of Mr. Talbot is presented as this posh figure who is uncomfortable with losing some of his creature comforts gone on this ship. And so the first 100 or so pages of this are him having this culture shock of being on the ship and not being sure what his role is. And there's a kind of like screwball comedy style to these first early scenes. He's introducing up to what life on the ship is like, and he's trying to ham up just how gross it is, and he's writing diary entries, and he's also a bit of an odd dude. Like, his diary entries are numbered, but he often forgets where he's up to. So for example, this chapter is just called ? And it feels like it's supposed to be funny until midway through the book something happens, and then things start to go downhill and people start to blame each other and somebody dies, and it's just getting really serious on this ship that was previously really funny. And I feel like William Golding, in his thematic trends, I mean, I can't really say this because I've only read 2 of his novels now, but the thing that's common between Rites of Passage and Lord of the Flies is, first of all, this idea of the breakdown of traditional social hierarchies into a more animalistic might makes right kind of theme. So we see that very clearly in Lord of the Flies, where the older and stronger boys kind of just feed back into their animalistic instincts and just go off hunting. And in Rites of Passage, very similarly, Mr. Talbot, despite having social capital, doesn't get to assume a position of leadership or authority, and that's what leads to a lot of the conflict and tragedy in this text. So that's first theme. The second theme is the idea of kind of the darkness within the human soul, and when humans are left to their own devices, bad things tend to happen. And this is not one of my favorite themes of literature. I find that a lot of late modernist works tends to reflect this theme because of historical events at the time, and I wonder if people in that time was just so optimistic and then discovered the dark nature of humanity through World War II and through all the historical events there, because on the other side of that, like in 2024, we know that the human condition is deeply flawed and dark and has problems, right? So I don't really need to be told that, and that just means that a novel like this is just a lot less poignant. So there are another 2 novels in the series, and for whatever reason I actually own the second volume of it. I think I got it thrifting or through some kind of compilation box. I don't really know how I have it, but I do. I don't really feel I want to read any more of this, though. I think William Golding as an author, this doesn't really strike me as one of my favorites, and I actually read this weird tangent as well about him winning the Nobel Prize. Apparently there was some manipulation to make sure that Graham Greene never won the Nobel Prize, and so William Golding was given the prize, and people kind of secretly knew that his work was not that great, or like good but not Nobel good. It's just a lot of drama, and it's funny to unearth that 50 years into the future and trying to see how all this stuff plays out. But the book itself is a 2 out of 5. It's one of those Booker Prize winners where I'm like, if this didn't win a prize, we would not be talking about this right now. And it's not really worth going back in time to try and experience this unless you're on some quest to read all the Bookers, or you just love William Golding for whatever reason. You want to read everything that he wrote. Each to one's own. I give it a 2 out of 5. Book number 2, The Girl of Curious Hair by David Foster Wallace. This is the first DFW book that I've read. I will eventually do Infinite Jest. I am aware of the various red flag tendencies of this author and liking this author and his style, but I was very curious. I was very interested in what this book had to offer in terms of the short stories, and it's pretty good. I think I'm reading too much into it a little bit because a number of these stories feel like manifestos. They feel like interrogations of television and entertainment and celebrity culture that was really kind of burgeoning in the 70s and 80s and 90s, like late night talk shows and quiz shows and other forms of popular culture, nightclubs, like events and places in society that have this vapid consumeristic culture where you're not really sure what's real anymore. But I also really situate this novel thematically in between kind of the 1980s Bret Easton Ellis bleak postmodernism and the more realistic, sincere, almost historical, personable postmodernism that we get in the 2000s. This book seems to be, to me, a transitional text moving from one end to the other. So we do have some of those really bleak elements here. The title story is incredibly bleak and violent and has characters that are kind of hateful and spiteful, but a number of stories here are also showing those stories in the light of how they can also be funny and also be quite humanistic toward the people they represent. So Girl of Curious Hair is interesting for fitting into that historical and thematic style. Is it fun to read? Sort of. I think maybe because I'm a massive nerd at this point and I kind of understand these contextual cues, it's fun to see influences from authors from before him and authors from after him. But this short story collection individually, outside of the stylistic concerns, I would say maybe there's 1 or 2 stories that are really worth reading. The first story, Little Expressionless Animals, is about a Jeopardy show and about a queer relationship and about how people devote their lives to certain information and how certain life causes can just be made meaningless and absurd through consumer culture. It's just a very complicated text, and I just love it for the ending where there's this kind of clashing of the incredibly silly, meaningless valuelessness of reality TV clashing with just the most emotional moment that someone could have in their entire life, this incredible moment of being. And all of that happening at once, superimposed one on the other, to me was very poignant. And I hope that's something that people can gain if they choose to read this. Aside from that, a lot of the other stories, they're okay. They're okay. I don't remember all of them. They're pretty good. They're alright. They're okay. Oh, 4 out of 5. 4 out of 5. That's what I was supposed to do. 4 out of 5. Book number 3, Jack by Marilynne Robinson. Now, this is the last book in the Gilead with the John Ames quadrilogy. There are 4 books in this series now, and this one is the last to be released so far, and hopefully the last in the series. I really, really wish that Marilynne Robinson would continue to write more. I don't know if I'd want more in this series, because now that I've finished all the Marilynne Robinson novels, it's interesting how her career is Housekeeping, which is an incredible self-contained novel, which is very brilliant but very small. And then we have Gilead, which is this expansive, multi-generational story about John Ames, the preacher in Iowa. And then we have Home and Lila and Jack, each of which are offshoots of this Gilead story, and each of them explore one of the characters from a different angle. And Jack really is the second novel of Jack Borton. So the first novel is Home, where Jack Borton arrives back at his father's house to try and take care of his father at the end of his life, and is trying to be forgiven, and it's narrated by Jack's sister, Glory, who also has always forgiven Jack, but recognizes how Jack as a character kind of is very much a prodigal son archetype. So he's the son of a preacher, and in his youth was a bit of a troublemaker and developed a bad reputation around the town, committed a bunch of crimes, ran off from home a bunch of times, and all of that is kind of backstory in both Gilead and Home. And in Home, Jack is reckoning with the fact that he's been forgiven by his preacher father, and also theologically been forgiven in terms of sin, but he can't accept that because he's still grappling with viewing himself as a screw-up and trying to reconcile his past with his present. And Home was such a beautiful novel, and it was just incredible all the way through. I was crying the entire time. It was amazing. And Jack, to me, is kind of set during the period of Jack Borden's misbehaving. So at the start of the novel, we meet Jack and Della, who is a African American woman in St. Louis in a time of segregation. She's also a pastor's daughter, and they develop this sort of quasi-romance because one day Della's walking down the streets in pouring rain, carrying a bunch of books, and she drops them all, and then Jack, who's just been released out of jail, runs across the road and kind of helps her with the books. And he steals a bunch of the books to read for himself, and eventually he chooses to return them to her by meeting in this graveyard. And so the novel begins in this graveyard with a conversation. We slowly start to learn a bit more about these characters, and that graveyard scene, this book is about 300 pages, that graveyard scene is 100 pages. It is a full conversation. And whereas the previous books in this series, especially Lila, are non-linear and feature lots of different scenes and scenes kind of melding into one another, Jack is probably the most straightforward of all the books in this series. It is just a very self-enclosed romance story with kind of hints of the future and hints of the past, but I feel like you could probably read this by itself and enjoy it for what it is. Now, I thought I wouldn't like it quite as much because of that, and then midway through, it's just magic. Like, Marilynne is just an amazing writer, tugged at my heartstrings so well, and towards the end I was just absolutely strung along for the ride. So required knowledge here, and it's not a spoiler for any of the Gilead series, but Jack eventually goes back to his father's house to try and reconcile things, and his relationship with Della doesn't end positively. And you kind of, if you've read the previous books, you know that going into this text. And so the way that this book plays with the expectations of something bad is going to happen, but how is that going to happen, coupled with this is a book set in a segregated city about an interracial relationship. Something bad is going to happen. What is the bad thing that's going to happen, and how will that happen? And how will it happen to this character of Jack, who, over the course of the text, we actually tend to grow really, really fond towards because he's trying so hard to better himself. It's just good. It's just a really good story. And just the way that it keeps the audience guessing towards the end is just some of the best writing I've read all year. I think the way that it's given me an emotional response to something happening that doesn't even happen in the book. Like the possibility of it happening had my heart racing and had my emotions going into overdrive about fictional characters is just amazing. It is just nothing short of one of the best reading experiences I've ever had. And so I do have to give it a 5 out of 5. And it makes me unhappy because now Lila is the only Marilynne Robinson book that I've read that doesn't get a 5 out of 5. And I kind of want to go back and see if I missed anything there, because this is an amazing book by an amazing writer, and I really can't recommend it enough. I don't know if I'll go back to this though. I think I will want to read Gilead again. I will want to read Housekeeping again. I may read Lila again to try and give that 5 out of 5 somehow. Jack is just a nice little self-enclosed ride. And if Marilynne Robinson wants to write more of these and more and more and more, I'll continue consuming them. But this is not kind of the big explosive 5 out of 5 that Gilead or Home are to me. This is just a wonderful book, written wonderfully, communicating its emotions wonderfully. not only is there anything wrong with it, but it's also expansively beautiful. It's just a good book. I do have to say a little bit about the representation of race, though, which I thought was interesting. I mentioned in Lila, the review for Lila, that I am wary of Robinson's representation of disadvantaged characters and raced characters, because to me I feel like the novel's working best when she's talking about those old preacher characters that to me feel very familiar and real, as if they're familiar to her as well. And it was a bit harder for me to believe Lila as a character coming from a disadvantaged background. And I thought possibly the same would happen with Della, because it is an African-American family and because the history there is a bit different. It is very well researched, but for most of the text I felt like race wasn't a big consideration. And I wonder if the reason why that's the case is because for Jack, race is not a really big consideration. Like, Jack doesn't really think about race very much at all. And so that's mirrored in the way that we follow his character and we follow his attitudes towards leadership, which is just not to mention race very much. And there are characters who do mention race very clearly here, and there are moments where race plays a part. But I also feel like, believably, a story about an interracial relationship in a segregated city, race would come up a lot more than it does here. And so that kind of sat at the back of my head as something that didn't let me fully draw into this text and read it almost like a fantasy, as like everything's there where it needs to be, but maybe it's not exactly the way that it would have played out in real life. That just kind of stayed there. It doesn't stop it from being a 5 out of 5. I think it's still an amazing book, but it is still a consideration that I kind of couldn't let go of. Book number 4, I'm going to have a lot of thoughts about this one. So, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison is an incredible, incredible book, and I am just mind-boggled that I haven't read it yet, and that was just so low on my radar until now. I'm reading it as part of my Make Me Cry series, and I was trying to find a book that would deliberately make me sad, and the pull quote from Jack Croft from Philip Roth: "Those of us who have been willing to taught and who need to be have been made by Invisible Man less stupid than we were about Negro lives." And it is an African-American author that kind of sits between the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Excellence, or the Black Arts movement, and it's kind of hard to fit into either of those categories. It's just a fantastic book, though, and thinking about the grander scheme of American fiction, Invisible Man does what a lot of kind of seminal American texts do, but way before. So I can kind of see the DNA of something like Catcher in the Rye and Rabbit Run and Death of a Salesman, and a lot of texts that explore the idea of what America becomes, or America has become, and the disassociated, conflicted identity that Americans have because of the legacy of inequality of this country. All of that happens in those books in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that's all very hard-hitting and all very known for being classic American fiction. Invisible Man predates all of that, and it does it better than all of those books. So we follow a protagonist who is unnamed, and from youth they are portrayed as someone who's kind of had to fight their way to the top. So the very first scene of this text is a kind of battle royale where African-American youths are being made to fight one another to try and win a prize, and that's being observed by a white crowd as a spectacle. And after that, the narrator gives a powerful speech to the audience that's kind of memorized about the natural subjugated role of African-American lives in a way to try and appeal to the white audience. And he's kind of being prodded along to give the speech the entire time. He's doing it against his will. And because he's able to do this, he's given a scholarship to a all African-American university. And the story kind of develops from there, where he's this character that is trying to figure out what it means to be African-American in society in America. And he's not very good at catching on to some of the cues that societal constructions have for him, because they don't make sense, and because they wouldn't be intuitive. And so because of that, we see this character who's very, on one hand, naive, but on one hand also very determined and powerful, try to make his way through all of America, journeying from this all-African American university in the South to Harlem and to all the different communities in New York, trying to make a name for himself and trying to fight for justice and fairness, even though the various social institutions that would give him the power to do this end up failing him in so many ways. And the novel, from a genre perspective, you could call it a picaresque novel, which is a novel about a character who doesn't really fit into society, kind of bumbling through a bunch of different episodes. The episodic nature of it is really key to the genre. I've read a few of them this year, actually. So Confederacy of Dunces is a very famous one, where we have this character who we follow through the entire text, and we don't necessarily feel like we are them because they're such a defined character, and yet their stark contrasts with the society around them, which is also quite exaggerated, shows something about the values about human beings in a particular time. I think it's done really, really well. So what I was so amazed too was that the narrator is amazing at giving speeches, and there are some moments in the text which feel quite prophetic about how society and class and race would work out in today even. So there's scenes of workers' unions and workers' strikes and disputes. There's scenes of mental health and psychological treatment and therapy. There's scenes of economic manipulation and disparity, and there's scenes of racial violence, scenes of police violence, things that are constantly talked about and are problems that have not been solved today. And this book almost seems to predict the way that would go. Like, often I'm so surprised at how old this text is, because it seems like it's speaking to me today, and it's so sad that the problems that it raises are just not solved today as well. But it's still very edifying to me to read this and to see that people have been thinking about this all through time and building into the fabric of American culture and literature using these ideas. And it's quite tragic the way that I think structurally and thematically the ideas of this book then wound its way down deep into the core of American fiction. And yet this aspect of racial justice that this novel really focuses on kind of got lost a little bit. Like, to me, it's very sad, but it gives me the desire to read more from African American authors. It reminds me of the fact that so much of current culture and literature and the canon, so to speak, of modern classics owes so much to the civil rights movement and African American liberation all through the 20th and 21st centuries. So these books are incredibly important and not something that should be set aside because they're about a particular group of Americans. They're relevant to everybody, and they're deeply, deeply relevant to the way that we look at all human beings today in terms of their values and their value to society and their value to one another. It is just an incredible read, and one other thing that I love about it too is that because the narrator is so good at giving speeches, I find that when characters sometimes are creative, like they're writers or they're musicians or they're artists or whatever in novels, at some point the narrator needs to start describing the art that they do, and that's when things start to fall apart for me, because sometimes the descriptions of the art are just not that compelling, or at least not fitting of the kinds of reactions that other characters have to it. Whereas here in this text, the speeches that the narrator gives are genuinely amazing text-wise. Like, writing them out, the way that the words, the language, the sentences, like all of that is written is just incredible. And it makes perfect sense why these speeches are able to just rile up the emotions of all the characters in this text, because they do the same to me. Like, they get me feeling so strongly about characters that I actually don't know very well because of the episodic structure. There's not a lot of characters that remain relevant through the whole text. So even in those little small moments, the speeches are so good. And the intelligence and control of language by Ralph Ellison is just tremendously impressive as well. I just can't think of many novels I've read this year where every sentence is felt so controlled and carefully chosen. The literary references are expansive as well. Ellison studied deeply lots of different classical authors. We see DNA from everything from like the Russian classics to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy to old classic American texts to old classic English texts. Like, it's very, very well studied, but it's also very close to ordinary human beings and trying its best to be relevant to all audiences. It is a huge book to try and do all of that. And I think it is quite successful in so many of the things it sets it to do. It is messy, though, I will admit. It's very long, and a lot of things go on, and not everything is going to be everyone's favorites, but as a whole, it is just such an amazing work. I would give it a 5 out of 5. I am so glad for reading it, and after finishing it, I want to just go and read all the novels that it mentions and it addresses as well. So I want to go and read Richard Wright, I want to go and read James Baldwin, Ellison, all those authors, right? I want to go and read all of them, and I want to see all the things that I've been missing out because I've kind of pigeonholed these texts as being just about racial justice. It's about so much more than that, and I would absolutely strongly recommend go out and read this book. It is really, really good. Last one for the month, Bridget Jones's Diary. I got it as an ebook because I didn't particularly want to own a copy of this, and the reason why is probably not a very good reason. I think there's just still such an existing stigma about popular fiction, romantic comedy, women's fiction, and this book really started off that big chick lit wave in the 1990s. I can't really think of many books that came before this that followed in the same vein, but structurally and just the way that it's told and marketed, its use of voice and characterization, to me, it feels like this book and after it started quite a big movement. And I want to say that's a good thing. Like, any movement that creates more interest in fiction and gets people talking about fiction is a great thing, even if it's not something that I personally think I would appreciate. But that being said, this is actually, for me, a pretty good book. I really enjoy the voice. I think the character was done quite well, and for all it's worth, right? For all I think about British humor and insult comedy, I don't always tend to like it. But in this case, I think that the author really strikes that balance between kind of like biting, sharp comedy with just enough heart and human interest there that it doesn't really feel very mean-spirited. Like, I feel like even with Jane Austen's works, there are times where I think, oh, it just feels kind of mean. Like, it doesn't feel right laughing at these characters because it's just attacking vice. And whereas this book does do that, a lot of that vice is directed at, on one hand, the protagonist, but also on the societal expectations that the protagonist is expected to be as a woman, which is a much better target than other things, right? And I think that works out really well. I think that it is really rooted in 90s and 2000s cultural footnotes. I think the kinds of fad diets and celebrity culture and all those vapid things that would have been really popular on daytime TV, that's all present here, and that's a very good target for comedic satire. I think this character starts off as someone who's really worried about weight and appearance, but also on being a suitable match or suitor. She seems to think that being single is just a problem that she needs to solve, and this problem is comorbid with a lot of other anti-stereotypically feminine things. Like, she can't cook, and she's not dainty, she doesn't dress well, and all of those things that stereotypically would make a woman desirable. She wants those things, but she doesn't have those things. And this ends up being a story about how the chasing after those things is ultimately quite silly, and there are people in the world that will accept you for who you are regardless of whether or not you fit this traditional mold or not, which is great. Like, I think that's just at core a really good story, and also a really heartening and reasonable one to make a comedy. It really doesn't feel like it's going in any wrong direction, even though I think you could make quite a reasonable complaint against this novel for its mainly body image jokes, but also things about social class and about masculinity and femininity. Like, yeah, it's not the best. And for something written in the 1990s, it's not progressive, right? But it is surprisingly gentle, which is really quite nice. And it is, I should mention, riffing off Pride and Prejudice in a way that's not always beneficial for the work, I think. So the core narrative of Pride and Prejudice is pretty ingrained in culture to this point, and I feel like the novel surprises just don't really work because of how tied they are to Pride and Prejudice. Like, I feel like the plot points of Pride and Prejudice do use surprise at various points to get get the audience's attention, and that surprise is just gone in Bridget Jones's Diary because you just know exactly what's going to happen. Just even when a character or an event is introduced, the second that you realize they correspond to the certain thing in Pride and Prejudice, you're like, oh, I know exactly what's going to happen. Like, the surprise is gone. And, I mean, I'm not reading this to be taken on a roller coaster plot, so I can forgive it for that. But I also do wish that it had more of a keep the audience guessing element to it. But aside from that, it's good. I chuckled. It's breezy. There's really not too many complaints I can make about it. It is very wears its heart on its sleeve about what it is, and it succeeds in many of the missions that it sets out to achieve. So it's good. 3 out of 5. What, really? Alright, those are books of November. Thank you for joining. It has been a really good month. Some very, very good books, and some more good books to come in December as well. Thank you for joining again. It's been a good time, and it's rare that I get to say that. I'm not complaining, I'm not judging, I'm just talking about books that I like. It's what I made the channel for, so it has been good.